Welcome learners. Now let us see about the various clustering methods. A clustering algorithm analyzes natural groups of data based on some similarities. It locates the centroid of the group of data points. For clustering to be effective, the algorithm evaluates the distance between each point from the centroid of the cluster. The goal of clustering is to determine the group in a set of unlabeled data. This diagram depicts the input of raw data and it is fed into the clustering algorithm and thereby the data is clustered. Now let us see about the k-means clustering. K-means is probably the most popular clustering algorithm. It is easy to understand and implement the code. Consider this picture for an illustration. In k-means clustering, to begin with, randomly select the number of classes or groups to use and initialize their respective center points. The center points are vectors of same length as each data point vector. Each data point is classified by computing the distance between that data point and each group center and then classifies the point to be in the group whose center is closest to it. Based on the classified points, recompute the group center by taking the mean of all the vectors in the group. Further, repeat these steps for number of iterations or until the group centers do not change much between iterations. Now, you also randomly initialize the group center a few times and then select the run looks to provide best results. K-means have the advantages such that it is very fast and it needs very few computations. Thus, it has a linear complexity of order of n. On the other hand, k-means has disadvantages too. K-medians is another variation of k-means algorithm, except instead of recomputing the group center points using the mean, we can use the median vector of the group. It is less sensitive to outliers because of using the median, but it is much slower for larger data sets as sorting is required when computing the median vector. Hope you would have understood. Now let us see about what is mean shift clustering. Mean shift clustering is a sliding window based algorithm that attempts to find dense areas of data points. It is also a centroid based algorithm. Its goal is to locate the center points of each groups or class, which works by updating candidates for center points to be the mean of the points within the sliding window. To eliminate near duplicates, these candidate windows filtered in a post-processing stage forms the final set of center points and their corresponding groups. Consider this picture for an illustration. In mean shift clustering for a single sliding window, let us now consider a set of points in two-dimensional space with a circular sliding window centered at a point C that is randomly selected and having the radius as the kernel. Mean shift is a hill climbing algorithm that involves shifting this kernel iteratively to a higher density region on each step until convergence. At every iteration, the sliding window is shifted towards region of high density by shifting the center point of the mean of points within the window, and hence the name came. The density within the sliding window is proportional to the number of points inside it. Naturally, by shifting to the mean of the points in the window, it will gradually move towards areas of higher point density. Now, continue shifting the sliding window according to the mean until there is no direction at which a shift can accommodate more points inside the kernel. Look at the graph above. Here it keeps on moving the circle until no longer the density are increased, that is, the number of points in the window. This process of steps from 1 to 3 are done with many sliding windows until all points lie within a window. When multiple sliding windows overlap the window, most of the points are preserved. Now the data points are clustered according to the sliding window in which they reside. Let us look at an illustration of the entire process from end to end with all the sliding windows is shown below. Each black dot represents a centroid of a sliding window and each grey dot is a data point. The entire process of mean shift clustering is, in contrast to k-means clustering, there is no need to select the number of clusters as mean shift automatically discovers the clusters. The fact that the cluster centers converge towards the points of maximum density is also quite desirable, as it is quite intuitive to understand and it fits well in a naturally data driven sense. The drawback is that the selection of the window size or radius r can be non-trivial. Now, let us look about density based spatial clustering of applications with noise called as dbScan. dbScan is a density based cluster algorithm similar to mean shift with some notable advantages. Now, let us look at this picture. dbScan begins with an arbitrary starting data point that is not been visited. The neighborhood of this point is extracted using a distance epsilon, that is, all points which are within the distance are neighborhood points. Now, if there are a sufficient number of points according to the minimum points within its neighborhood, then the clustering process starts and the current data point becomes the first point in the new cluster. Otherwise, the point will be labeled as noise, that is, later this noisy point might become the part of the cluster. In both cases, that point is marked as visited. For this first point in the new cluster, the points within its epsilon distance neighborhood also become part of the same cluster. This procedure of making all points in the epsilon neighborhood belong to the same cluster is repeated for all the new points that have been just added to the cluster group. This process of steps 2 and 3 are repeated until all the points in the cluster are determined, that is, all points within the epsilon neighborhood of the cluster have been visited and labeled. Once it is done with the current cluster, a new unvisited point is retrieved and processed, leading to the discovery of a further cluster or noise. This process repeats until all points are marked as visited. Since at the end of this all points have been visited, each point will have been marked as either belonging to a cluster or being noisy. dbScan has advantages over other clustering algorithms. Firstly, it does not require a preset number of clusters. It also identifies outliers as noises, unlike mean shift that simply throws them into a cluster even if the data point is very different. In addition, it is able to find arbitrarily sized and arbitrarily shaped clusters quite well. The major drawback of dbScan is that it does not perform well when the clusters are of varying density. This is because the setting of the distance threshold epsilon and min points for identifying the neighborhood points will vary from cluster to cluster when the density varies. This drawback also occurs with very high dimensional data, since again the distance threshold epsilon becomes challenging to estimate. Now, let us see about the expectation maximization clustering using Gaussian mixture models, that is GMM. One of the main drawbacks of k-means is its naive use of the mean value for the cluster center. On the left hand side, it looks obvious to the human eye that there are two circular centers with different radii centered at the same mean. K-means cannot handle this because the mean values of the clusters are very close together. K-means also fails in cases where the clusters are not circular, again because of using the mean as cluster center. Gaussian mixture model called as GMM gives us more flexibility than K-means. With GMM, we assume that the data points are Gaussian distributed. The two parameters to describe the shape of the clusters are the mean and standard deviation. Taking an example in 2 dimensions, this means that the clusters can take any kind of elliptical shape since we have a standard deviation in both the x and y directions. Thus, each Gaussian distribution is assigned to a single cluster. In order to find the parameters of the Gaussian for each cluster, example the mean and the standard deviation, an optimization algorithm called as an expectation maximization algorithm is used. By viewing the graph below, it is an illustration of the Gaussians being fitted to the clusters. Then we can proceed on to the process of expectation maximization clustering using GMMS. In this algorithm, we begin by selecting the number of clusters, that is as k-means does, and randomly initialize the Gaussian distribution parameters for each cluster. Moreover, we can try to provide a good Gauss estimate for the initial parameters by taking a good look at the data too. Given those Gaussian distributions for each cluster, compute the probability of each data point belongs to a particular cluster. The closer a point is to the Gaussian center, the more likely is to be the belonging of that cluster. This should make an intuitive sense since with the Gaussian distribution, we are assuming that most of the data lies closer to the center of the cluster. Given those Gaussian distributions for each cluster, compute the probability of each data point belongs to a particular cluster. The closer a point is to the Gaussian center, the more likely it belongs to that cluster. This should make an intuitive sense since with the Gaussian distribution, we are assuming that most of the data lies closer to the center of the cluster. Based on these probabilities, we will compute a new set of parameters for the Gaussian distributions such that we maximize the probabilities of data points within the cluster. We compute those new parameters using a weighted sum of the data point positions where the weights or the probabilities of the data point belonging to that particular cluster. Now we will explain this in visual manner. We can take a look at the graph above, in particular the yellow cluster as an example. The distribution will start off randomly on the first iteration, but we can see that most of the yellow points are to the right of that distribution. When we compute the sum of weighted by the probabilities, even though there are some points near the center, most of them are on the right. Thus, naturally the distribution's mean is shifted closer to those set of points. We can also see the most of the points are top right to the bottom left. Therefore, the standard deviation changes to create an ellipse that is more fitted to those points in order to maximize the sum weighted by. Now, repeat the steps 2 and 3 iteratively until convergence, where the distributions do not change much from iteration to iteration. Now, GMM has 2 key advantages. At first, GMM is more flexible in terms of cluster covariance than k-means due to the standard deviation parameter. The clusters can take on an ellipse shape rather than being restricted to circles. K-means is actually a special case of GMM in which each cluster's covariance along all dimensions approach to 0. Secondly, since GMMs use probabilities, they will have multiple clusters per data point. So, if data point is in the middle of 2 overlapping clusters, we can simply define its class by saying that it belongs to X person to class 1 and Y person to class 2, that is GMM support mixed membership. Now, let us see about agglomerative hierarchical clustering. Hierarchical clustering algorithms actually fall in 2 categories. They are top-down and bottom-up approach. Bottom-up algorithms treat each data point as a single cluster at the outset and then successively merge pairs of clusters until all clusters are merged into a single cluster that contains all data points. In bottom-up hierarchical clustering, it is therefore called as hierarchical agglomerative clustering or it is called as HAC. This hierarchy of clusters is represented as a tree called as dendrogram. The root of the tree is the unique cluster that gathers all the samples, the leaves being the clusters with only one sample. Now let us look at the graph below for an illustration before moving on to the algorithm steps. In agglomerative hierarchical clustering, we begin by treating each data point as a single cluster, that is, if there are x data points in our data set, then we have x clusters. We can select a distance matrix that measures the distance between two clusters. As an example, we will use the average linkage which defines the distance between two clusters to be the average distance between data points in the first cluster and data. On each iteration, we combine two clusters into two. The two clusters are combined as those with the smallest average linkage. That is, according to our selected distance metric, these two clusters have the smallest distance between each other. Therefore, there are more similarities and should be combined. In step 2, it is repeated until we reach the root of the tree, that is, we will have only one cluster which contains all data points. In this way, we can select as many clusters we want in the end simply by choosing when to stop combining the clusters. That is, when to stop building the tree. Hierarchical clustering does not require us to specify the number of clusters, and we can even select which number of clusters looks best since we are building a tree. Additionally, it is not sensitive to the choice of distance metric. All of them tend to work equally well, whereas with other clustering algorithms, the choice of distance metric is vertical. Hierarchical clustering does not require us to specify the number of clusters, and we can even select which number of clusters look best since we are building a tree. Additionally, it is not sensitive to the choice of distance metric. All of them tend to work equally well, whereas with other clustering algorithms, the choice of distance metric is critical. Good use of hierarchical clustering methods is used when the underlying data has a hierarchical structure and we want to recover the hierarchy. Other clustering algorithms cannot be used. These advantages of hierarchical clustering come at the cost of lower efficiency, as it has a time complexity of order of n square, unlike the linear complexity of k-means and GMM. These advantages of hierarchical clustering come at the cost of lower efficiency, as it has time complexity of order of n cube, unlike the linear complexity of k-means and GMM. Let us now summarize. Clustering aims at grouping data objects into classes so that objects within a class are similar while the objects in different classes are dissimilar. Conventional clustering algorithms compute the distances between objects in the entire space of dimensions. However, as the number of dimensions increases, the data objects become sparse. Indeed, any 2 points may become nearly equidistant. In such scenarios, clusters often hidden in specific subspaces of the original feature space rather than in original feature space. Thank you, friends.